Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session of GSF. I'm delighted to see you all here today, both in person here at the National Liberal Club and those who are watching us online, which I'll come to in a little. Today's event is co-hosted with the Oxford Media Network, and Deborah Pout, the founder, will now say a few words.
I don't want to take too much time as we've got our amazing speaker, Tom Fletcher, but it's a pleasure to be collaborating once again with Global Strategy Forum. We've had a very fruitful collaboration in the past. And actually how I met Lord Lothian was when he gave a lecture at St Anthony's College in Oxford. I was doing my research on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's how our paths first crossed. So it's, I feel, a very apt full circle for today's event. I wanted to thank Global Strategy Forum and in particular Jacqueline Jinks and Lord Lothian for collaborating once again, and Paddy Coulter, Michael Crick, Jenny Darnley, who've always been very supportive of this venture. So without further ado, I'd like to hand back to Lord Lothian.
Thank you very much, Debbie. I'm afraid a long time ago we met talking about Israel-Palestine. I'm not sure we're any nearer to a solution now than we were then.
That will be for
anything,
another event.
If anything, it may have gone in the opposite direction.
Yes.
But I'm really here today to give a very warm welcome to our speaker, Tom Fletcher. I will introduce him fully in a minute, but I want to give you a couple of short housekeeping notes. I can say, though, that I'm delighted Tom agreed to speak to us. I've been very keen to have him here for a long time, since the publication of his first book, The Naked Diplomat, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome him here today. But first, a couple of housekeeping notes. Our next event will be a lunchtime event like this one. It'll take place on Wednesday, the 14th of June. Sir David Omond, who is currently a visiting professor in the War Studies Department at King's College London, will be coming to talk about his new book, which is entitled How to Survive a Crisis, Lessons in Resilience and Avoiding Disaster. So that should be pretty interesting. It'll be published at the beginning of next month, and in a sense it'll be a launch when he's here. He is, of course, well known to many of you thanks to his very distinguished career in government service, during the course of which he held at various times the positions of the United Kingdom's first Security and Intelligence Coordinator, Permanent Secretary at the Home Office, and Director of GCHQ. Invitations will be sent out next week, so please keep an eye on your inboxes if you would like to attend. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to apologise for my voice. And if I get a fit of coughing, I'm recovering from a cold, so I hope we'll get through this without too much interruption. But turning to today, the event is a hybrid one with both a remote and an in-person audience. For those attending the event remotely via Zoom, it is view only. For any remote audience members who would like to ask a question, please submit it in writing through the Q&A function, and then that'll be transferred to me and I will pose it to our speaker. For those here in person, if I do call you, please give your names when I call you, and please do wait for the microphone to catch up with you. There will be a roving microphone going around. But if I can turn to our speaker, I've got an enormously long biography here, which I'm not going to read out. I'm just going to highlight one or two of the items. He is the principal of Hertford College, Oxford, which is a very distinguished college in my old university. He was previously the foreign policy advisor to 3 United Kingdom prime ministers between 2007 and 2011. And before that, he was the UK ambassador. No, after that, he was the UK ambassador in Lebanon, which I had a particular interest in at the time. More recently, he's been a visiting professor at New York University. He founded the foundation, I have to give this because it sounds so good, the Foundation for Opportunity, which supports good people doing good things in public life. That sounds a very excellent thing to support. He led a review of British diplomacy, first of all on the Foreign Office, and also on the future of the United Nations. He's written, I think it is 3 books, The Naked Diplomat, which I mentioned, which is called Power and Politics in the Digital Age, 10 Survival Skills for a World In Flux, which I think we have up here at the moment, and The Ambassador, which is a novel. As I said, it's wonderful to welcome you here today, Tom. 10 Survival Skills for a World in Flux is an excellent book. I think that the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, described it as a manifesto for a better way of educating humanity, which is quite a tribute. And it really is. It's full of unique insight and intelligence drawn from Tom's experience, both at the highest levels of diplomacy and now in the field of education. So I urge you to buy a copy if you haven't read it. They are on sale at the table over the corner, and I'm sure if you do buy one, Tom would sign it for you. We've also got his most recent book, The Ambassador, for sale today, which is a novel, which I'm going to get because I'm looking forward to reading it. I've reached that stage of my life where novels are a rather good way of passing the time. 10 Survival Skills, which I mentioned, was published last year, and Tom, in a sense, is here today to give us an update on that, if you like, on its application to the post-pandemic global landscape, which is proving decidedly turbulent to navigate. I think there's a great sense of instability in world affairs at the moment, and we've heard some of the geopolitical challenges coming from Hiroshima during the G7 summit this week. But there are also longer-term underlying forces driving global change, not least the speed of technological change and the debates we're currently having over the use of artificial intelligence. I know Tom will talk about those too. So he'll give his open presentation on surviving the 21st century, a world in flux, for about 20 minutes, after which I will ask him a question or two, if I may, and then I will open it to the floor and to our viewers who are watching on the outside. So without more ado, I'm going to ask Tom if he'll speak to us.
Thank you, Lord Lothian. Thank you very much indeed. And it's wonderful to have this chance to be here with you today. Just as Lord Lothian apologised for his voice, I have to apologise for a black eye, which I got 2 days ago. We're just recreating a boxing match that I took part in 25 years ago in Nairobi on my very first diplomatic posting, when I had a fight with the mayor of Nairobi. It was a fundraising fight in front of 3,000 Kenyan spectators. And the mayor and his supporters had T-shirts that said, "Fletcher goes home on a stretcher." And it looks as though in the recreation of the fight, we'll be recreating the stretcher part of it as well. So apologies for that, particularly if you're on this side, Ambassador. So where to begin? I mean, a starting place is maybe just to note that I think at least 2 of my former bosses are in the room, possibly more, which makes me very cautious about saying anything about foreign policy, diplomacy, or geopolitics. And so I'm making a rapid handbrake turn towards education, because I don't think that too many of my bosses on education are in the room at the moment. I'm hoping they're not watching along with us. Lord Lothian, thank you for not reading out that horrendous full list of things. But one thing that often pops up on that list is the foreign policy advisor to those 3 prime ministers. In those days, that took 3 or 4 years. I think this year, to be foreign policy advisor to 3 prime ministers took about 3 weeks at one point. It's one of those funny job titles, isn't it? Because everyone who has worked in Whitehall knows that the real job title is the private secretary for foreign affairs to the prime minister. And I was on one trip to China with the prime minister, and I couldn't work out why the Chinese diplomats on the other side of the table were nudging each other and giggling at my nameplate. As everyone knows, that doesn't tend to happen in bilateral summits with our Chinese friends and counterparts. And so I asked Sebastian Wood, our ambassador at the time, why are they laughing at my nameplate? And he realized that there'd been a mistranslation. And the job title, the private secretary for foreign affairs to the prime minister, had been rendered as the intimate typist. But actually even worse than that, the intimate typist for the prime minister's affairs overseas. And I can assure you, there were many things that I did for those 3 prime ministers, but I didn't do any intimate typing. But I was at various points a therapist and a punch bag and a speechwriter and a policy maker, and was able to have this extraordinary privilege of having that insight into how geopolitics happens at that level. And there's actually a story from that time that leads me towards education, which is where I'd like to focus. I spent very little time in that period with my young son, Charlie. Charlie is doing his GCSEs, literally at this moment, actually. He's doing the 1930s. Anyone doing GCSEs, or anyone whose kids have done GCSEs, knows that the GCSE in history is purely 1930s, Germany, America, Russia, China. He's in there doing that now. But in number 10, I had very little time with Charlie, and was feeling a very absent father. And so being in close proximity to all of these world leaders, I started to collect a book of advice for Charlie. And I would shuffle up to world leaders behind the press conference podium or backstage at the conference and ask them to write their advice for Charlie when he reached this age, when he reached 14, 15, 16. And gradually the project developed momentum. So we had, at one point, Bill Clinton wrote his advice out in draft and then copied it in. He spent more time on it than I used to spend writing submissions for Derek Plumley. And then George Bush took the book away. We thought we'd never get it back. It turned out that George W. Bush was a very slow reader. He read all the advice very methodically and then sent the book back. And Barack Obama got the book and said, Charlie will either be very rich or very clever, depending on whether he sells the book or keeps the book. But he did keep the book, and as a result, we've got this fantastic compendium of advice from world leaders for a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old about how to lead, how to think, how to live in the 21st century. And that was part of the reason why I slightly lost my way and fell out of diplomacy and into education, because I think any of us who are bringing up kids, any of us who are seeing their parents get older, think a lot about what are the essential skills that we must pass on to the next generation. And not just the essential skills, but also the knowledge and the values, the head, hand, and heart. And we've been doing that, of course, since prehistoric characters around the campfire were passing on those essential survival skills. And so I was thinking, what then are the survival skills that I would want my kids to think about? And another experience that crystallized that for me was the experience of serving with Derek and others in Beirut. And those days when you'd get into the convoy and wonder if the car you were driving past would be the car that would explode. It's a great way of focusing your mind on what you want to pass on to the next generation. And so I went to New York University, as Lord Lothian mentioned, and spent 2 years thinking about what should we put in the curriculum of the future. And the first thought that became very, very clear through that discussion was that we had to completely shift a mindset that my generation had grown up with. I was 14 years old in 1989. Berlin Wall came down. The video of that went viral long before YouTube. Apartheid starting to fall, the campaign for apartheid going viral long before Twitter. Tank Man in Tiananmen Square, that photo going viral long before Instagram, before we'd even thought of social media. But that period imprinted on all of our minds. And Francis Fukuyama famously saying it's the end of history. And all of us laughed a bit at that and wrote our undergraduate essays on why it wasn't the end of history, and yet somehow imprinted on our minds we believed it was. And there was that sense, I certainly felt, joining the Foreign Office in the mid-90s, end of the 90s, that history was heading in one direction. And in a way, I carried that idealism into that role in Beirut. 15, 20 years later, 2007, I got to Beirut. 2011, sorry. And I was grabbing the smartphone, and the first book talks a lot about this naked diplomat, and charging around with this sense that this was really the most powerful weapon in the Middle East. David and I have both written about the way that Twitter changes foreign policy and defense policy, geopolitics, and I really believed it. And I was watching it happen in the Arab Spring. I'm very conscious at the time that the smartphone that I was connecting to young people on was this amazing opportunity. It allowed me to have conversations with people I could never reach. Suddenly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people across the Arab world. But then it was also the device that terrorists were using to track my movements. And yet I focused much more on the opportunity and not on the challenge. We were in this early phase of social media diplomacy where we were too idealistic. We didn't realize that on the other side, Putin was already weaponizing the internet against us. And that many in the Middle East were going to use these tools to radicalize and polarize. And that many of those lessons and much of that language will make you great again. Will take you back to a time when you didn't have to coexist with these other people that don't look like you or believe the same things or pray to the same God. That language would be taken up by our own extremists and then turned against us too. So all of those experiences really led me to this debate with myself, really, on what I wanted to pass on to my kids, and therefore what I also thought should go into this curriculum of the future. And so we went off and we talked to world leaders, we talked to business leaders, we talked to diplomats, we talked to teachers, parents, refugees, and very importantly, to young people themselves about what they thought was missing in their education. And we came up with this structure: head, hand, and heart. That's not 21st century education, that's first century education. And we concluded that the next generation, for the head, have to really understand three really important things. One, the history of coexistence. How do we get from prehistoric man, from cave paintings to the driverless car? What was that journey? We tend to learn, as my son is learning and being assessed on today in his GCSE history exam, the history of the wars we won. But how do we actually learn to coexist between those wars? How do we actually learn to live together? Surely there is space to understand that journey in humanity's story. The second one for the head is, of course, the history of our relationship with the planet. And our next great peace process, the peace process of the future, the Nobel Prizes of the future will be awarded for the peace process with the planet. And then the third incredibly important theme that we focused on is the history of human ingenuity. I think the most powerful piece of television I've ever seen is that Jacob Bronowski series, The Ascent of Man, which takes you through the history of human ingenuity, takes you from cave paintings to the driverless car, and helps you understand how humans consciously evolved at those different points. And we are going to go through as much technological change in the next 100 years as in those last 43 centuries, back to those cave paintings. And so our kids and our grandkids will need to understand that process of human ingenuity. And then we looked at the skills, and we decided that the essential skills you need, firstly, the ability to keep learning. We all know the stats about the way that whole careers will be wiped out, actually faster than we calculated 2 or 3 years ago. When I talk to my students now, they can't understand a world that we understood. I'm off to be a lawyer, I'm off to be a doctor, I'm off to be a diplomat, I'm off to be a politician, I'm off to be a journalist. They'll have to consciously evolve and adapt to many, many different vocations and crafts. So how do you learn that understanding of how we as humans learn in different ways, our own learning styles, is absolutely vital. That generation have to really understand a second great skill as well, which is managing their physical and their mental health. And my generation spent a lot of time being slightly snooty and sneery about that younger generation struggles with mental health and worrying that they're all a bit flaky, a bit too wobbly. They need more scaffolding. They need to kind of get on with it. And yet, when you sit with an 18-year-old now who will be my age in 2050 doesn't seem a long way off. And when they look at the projections as to what we are doing to the planet now, it's pretty understandable that they feel fairly unscaffolded, that they feel the world is shaky. And so they'll need to work even harder to manage their mental and physical well-being. And then the third skill that we thought about was something called global competence. And we worked very hard with the OECD to develop a system that can not just teach global competence, but to assess it. because we realize that until you convince parents and teachers and businesses and recruiters and governments that this thing is tangible, that it can be assessed, then you'll never win the argument that it should be taught alongside STEM and other classic subjects, that it should be taught alongside a factory education where kids are memorizing stuff that ChatGPT can already do better than them. And what's global competence? We know it as emotional intelligence, as empathy. I describe it to my students as like understanding your Instagram filter. You need to know the filter through which you see the world and the filters through which other people see the world, and understand that we all see the world through different filters. And once you have that, then that can be a superpower. I think that's the most important 21st century survival skill, that ability to see the perspective of the other. It's Mandela putting on the Springbok shirt. It's so many of those moments in diplomacy that we've experienced. A moment when I saw one of those leaders in Northern Ireland in the midst of a peace process negotiation. The chair was faced away. He wouldn't face his opponent. And a moment of humanity when he turned the chair around to face his opponent and start to talk. That is a real superpower. And in education, in my new world, we call that set of skills 21st century skills, but many of you know that as diplomacy. And in a way, that's the journey for me to education and back to diplomacy, is that real understanding that education is now upstream diplomacy. If we can teach that skill, and it's a skill that will be automated long after the other skills are automated, then we can create this generation of citizen diplomats who will be going out there in a world where if diplomacy didn't exist, we need to invent it, but now we need to reinvent it. They'll be going out and hopefully doing this, whether or not they're working underneath a flag or underneath a portrait or a statue of a diplomat. And then we looked at the values. And this really comes back to that book of advice from world leaders, because if you boil down that entire book into three things, it's what my grandfather wrote in it just before he died. He said, be kind, be curious, be brave. And those are, without doubt, the essential superpowers for surviving this world of flux and uncertainty and instability. Kind, because we'll need a generation that is ready to take on this immense amount of inequality around us and this growing perception of inequality. There's that famous YouTube video of the two scientists with capuchin monkeys, and they give the two monkeys both more food, and then they give one more food than the other. And the one that has got less food, even though he's got more food than he had originally, breaks the cage down and attacks the scientist. A metaphor for Make America Great Again, for take back control. So with all that perception of inequality, we'll need a generation which is kinder than us. We'll need a generation that is curious, because the technological change coming their way is like nothing we've ever understood before. If you think about the impact of the printing press on European politics and society, and scale that right up, and that's what we're living through at this moment. It's happening all around us at a pace that we cannot comprehend. But they'll also have to be brave, because ultimately the answer will be what we know as empathy, as coexistence, and that will take courage, the courage to live together. I think the great peace processes of the future will not just be peace with the planet, but peace between migrants and host communities, hundreds of millions on the move within 20, 30 years. Peace between the generations. How will we settle with that generation coming up behind us into a world they will see as unfair? Peace with big tech. I tried to do, as Michael said, that report for the UN Secretary General, and many of you know the UN much, much better than I do, on the threats of the future and how do we mobilize technology in defense of humanity against those threats. We made 40 recommendations, and I can happily go into those recommendations if you'd like. Those of you who know the UN very well will not be surprised that the answer was to create 40 committees, one of which, the committee to look after the other committees, is the only one still in existence. But one of the issues we worked on in that report was the threat of lethal autonomous weapons. And we concluded, and we wrote a letter with Elon Musk in a previous iteration of Elon Musk and others, saying we are creating threats faster than we can manage them. You have to give us the rules. You have to ensure that the rules that protect our liberty and our security online can keep up with these weapons. 3 years later, the argument in the UN is still over who should draft the reply to that letter. You know, the systems that we built with such patience and sacrifice are just not up to the job of dealing with these new threats. So there's that peace process with big tech, and then ultimately the peace process with technology itself, the peace process with artificial intelligence. And that is all about these skills. It's about developing the creativity, the curiosity, the kindness, the ingenuity, the empathy to coexist with these new technologies. And that all leads me really to the last survival skill that we thought about. And then it'd be great to open up, and I promise to do some geopolitics if you can bear it. And that was an idea based on the work, actually, Derek, of someone that you and I knew in Beirut, Alexandra Asseli, who talked to me about the work she'd done as a psychologist on being a good ancestor. What does it mean to be a good ancestor? And a good ancestor thinks about the things we must forgive. How do we heal the wounds of history? The things for which we must seek forgiveness. How do we ensure that in our geopolitics and our diplomacy, we're not pretending that the baggage we carry does not exist? A good ancestor does think about being a filter, working out what to pass on to future generations and what we must not pass on. But also a good ancestor thinks, and it's an exercise I do with the students, about moving from a life based on a CV, the list of things that are read out at the start of a talk, to a life based on a eulogy, the things that someone says about you at the end of your life. And I hope that the survival skills of the future, and if we're able to develop them in this next generation, if we're able to see education as upstream diplomacy, will mean that more people are being spoken of at the end of their lives as kind and curious and brave. If that's the case, then I think we can be optimistic. But there is an enormous amount of work ahead of us. And my closing conclusion is that as a result, diplomacy, that old world of what we used to think of as maps and chaps and protocol and great buildings like this, is much too important to leave to diplomats. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I must say I find that absolutely fascinating. In the back of my mind, I have this one problem with it, is how you move from where we are now to what you're talking about, because we are all confined within the institutions that exist now. And one of the main ones in terms of geopolitics is the United Nations, which you know much more about than I do. It strikes me that one of the great problems with the present situation is that whenever you have a problem that needs resolving, whether it's Ukraine or something else, there is one big elephant in the room, and that is the permanent members of the United Nations and the veto. How do you get round that in order to move to the sort of thing you were talking about?
It's immensely difficult, isn't it? I was wondering recently if the history books would talk of this as a chapter from 1989 to 2016. Increasingly, I think they might talk about it as a chapter from 1945 to 2016, and that one of the conclusions, not just of the UN's effort to understand and respond to tech, but also of the UN's inability really to respond to the situation in Ukraine, to the pandemic. And this is not, of course, a criticism of those working in the UN system, who many of you know much better than I do and who are doing extraordinary work, incredible public servants, but is a product really of that institutional inertia and of the power politics of the UN. A great worry I have is that if we move too fast to disrupt that system before we have an alternative in place, we may end up in an even worse scenario. This great challenge of who actually has the convening power. All these great challenges we face, climate change, artificial intelligence, massive global migration, the next pandemic, the demographic bubble, all need some form of diplomacy and debate. But who gets to actually convene that conversation? In 1815, it wasn't difficult to work out who should be at the Congress of Vienna. The early debate was, do we let the French in? Always a good debate to have. Now, who convenes the conversation on artificial intelligence or climate change if it's not going to be the UN? And who decides? No one at the Congress of Vienna was popping up saying, now we need to hear from the youth rep, or the rep for business, or the rep from civil society, or the rep from Facebook. Who decides which of those constituencies get a place at the table? I think that's really, really difficult. And I suppose the lazy conclusion is to fall back on these coalitions of the willing. I think we have a new name for it now, which is better than, it's not a George W. Bush name for it, but it's basically coalitions of the willing.
Right, have we got half an hour now, so I'm going to open it to the floor, if I may. If I call you, could you please introduce yourself and say what you are about? The gentleman in the front here.
John Roberts, Energy Security Specialist, and dare one said, veteran of Beirut from 78 to 80.
Wow, what a time to be there.
I've just come back from a security conference in Tbilisi, Georgia, and one fact, I think it's accurate, struck me. It was an analysis by a sociologist of the social media of Republican congressmen and candidates in the midterm elections. In terms of their social media comments on Ukraine, 90% were negative. And much of that reflected, very often quite specifically, Russian disinformation and misinformation. How do we counter that? And how do we counter the fact that it's not merely, as it were, the natural isolationism of the contemporary Republican Party, but potentially the creeping isolationism in the Democrats as well?
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and it's such a good question that I'm actually going to pass half of it over to David, who's got a better answer than I have, because he's written the book on this. Do you want to go first, David? I'll do my bit. For me, the answer is that we've got to be in that argument, and so that was in a way it was the argument I was making to my diplomatic colleagues back in 2011 when we were experimenting with social media, experimenting with Twitter. At the time, I think there were 4 ambassadors on it, and now sort of all but 4 UK ambassadors are in there in some way. Although we've got much more cautious than that, but that's another question. I used to say, imagine that there's a great big diplomatic reception, and everyone you need to influence is in there, exchanging ideas and arguments. You wouldn't stand at the edge and say nothing. You wouldn't stand at the edge and just shout your lines to take into the room and hope that, and you wouldn't delegate it. You'd be in there in the argument, and it's uncomfortable and unpleasant, and you have to take lots of risks, but the biggest risk is not to be in that argument. And so I would basically say that's another reason why we need this army of citizen diplomats out there taking on those arguments online, rather than assuming that because the algorithm is being run in a certain way at the moment, that we have to leave that terrain to our opponents and to those who will drive opinion apart. But David, you're the guru.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. David Patrick-Harricos, author, journalist, I guess. Look, I mean, there's not much to add to what Tom says, which was particularly incisive. I mean, look, I've been dealing with this for a while, and I'm actually going to come at it at a slightly different angle, I think, and to say, I sort of work on policy with this sort of thing, and when we're looking at what we call the pollution of information spaces by things like, Russian troll farms and stuff, what I want to do, and what I want to try and get across whenever I discuss this, is that I think we need to actually recalibrate our approach to how we deal with this, because we do need to deal with this. And we are kind of obsessed with content, which is fair enough, which is, this stuff is terrible, we need to get rid of it. Now, if we take a step back and we look at misinformation, disinformation, we have a problem, which is that lying is not illegal, nor should it be banned. And we need lying, right? Your baby's beautiful. I think your father's wonderful. We can't get by in life without lying. And obviously a lot of this stuff is actually sort of truth neutral, so to say. It's sort of, when you look at the attacks on Hillary Clinton, they were, sometimes, she's running a paedophile ring out of a pizzeria, fine, but a lot of the time it was just, slurs on her character. And when I look at Russian disinformation a lot, I see what we need to do, I think, is take a step back and not focus on the content. And when I say that, look, there are things that that, like incitement to violence, racism. There are things that you are not allowed to say online anyway. They're illegal. They're not enforced. That's a separate issue. But I want to take a step back and say, let's not look at the content, but let's look on the behaviour. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is when we look at these floods of disinformation, for example, that you saw these comments below the line, if, I don't know, John from Essex wants to say that he believes that, Ukraine are a bunch of Nazis and that Russia has done nothing wrong, I guess we just have to live with that. But if it turns out that John from Essex is in fact Ivan from St. Petersburg, and that swarm of comments you're seeing are in fact being run out of a troll farm, that you can start to take down. And I think that's how we've got to start to do it. Because look, I'm going back into Ukraine a week on Sunday. I'm going to be hit with waves of this on Twitter and everywhere else. We can't stop people lying. We can't stop people being unpleasant, as fortunate as it is. We have to sort of take a step back and try and get the tech companies, because fundamentally these are where the platforms are where they appear, to try and address it like this, because we are being snowed with it at the moment. And we can't do it from the content point of view only. That's my comment on this.
Thank you very much
I was
indeed.
going to jump in and just give a postscript to that because it was spot on. But just because you mentioned Beirut, actually, and you mentioned troll farms, David, I think in 2012, 2013, we were experiencing the first wave of those troll farms. I think a lot of those experiments were being done through Syria. And I remember those very early days where suddenly you would get, and we didn't know it was trolls at the time, but you'd get thousands of messages online calling all sorts of horrible things. If you tweeted anything really in criticism of Assad. And those were the days when we should have seen it coming. I think we underestimated quite what a wave of this stuff there would be. But as usual, Beirut was the place where people were practicing doing horrible things to each other.
Thank you. I've got a question online from Sir Jeremy Greenstock.
Wow.
I'll read it out. There are some who think that the more intelligent a civilization, the more likely it is to destroy itself. Is that a real risk? Tom?
So this reminds me, the other day someone said, I'd done a talk on the case for optimism, and they said that I was like the guy you see falling past a window and you say, how's it going? And they say, all right so far, basically. There's a quote, is it the Macaulay quote where he says, on what base is it that when you look back at the progress that humans have made until now, we can see nothing but despair in front of us? I do think that we have got through periods of incredible challenge and danger and jeopardy through ingenuity, through that ability to coexist, through that ability to adapt. The challenge now is just the speeding up of the technological change around us. And one product of that, for example, is that I think much of the great talent coming out of our universities, including my own, is getting hoovered up by tech companies and not by those who should actually be trying to work out how we stop ourselves destroying ourselves. An example, I worked with a friend of some of ours, Casper Klinger, the first Danish tech ambassador. And it was in the first book, in The Naked Diplomat, I recommended that countries appoint an ambassador to tech to basically try and answer Jeremy's question. And I remember when Casper got appointed, I said, it'll be 3 years and you'll get headhunted by a massive tech company. And he's now the VP of Microsoft. It's a real danger to us that government and institutions, and as you said, Michael, the UN, the structures in place to police the new emperors just can't keep up with them. And that really, really does worry me. But I do remain an optimist, even as I fall past the window.
Lady at the front here, please.
Thank you very much, Simona Liskor, Ambassador of Slovenia, and it's good to see you, Tom, again. I've read the book, I had it signed, and I read all 3. But I would go back to the question about the young generation and the youth, and how to make them more engaged and active in the political life, to take part at the elections. So what would be your advice to your sons, to your students, or to the parties, political parties, how to address young people to take part at the election, that they will be able also to create their own futures. I just spoke recently to some Brits who were saying that they are active, they are progressive, but they don't take part at the elections because their voice is not heard, because of the voting system here. So my other question would be, does UK need to change the voting system? Thank you.
Great questions. I mean, and actually, the second question almost answers the first one. On the young people, this is such a live issue when you run a university, and we're in the midst of another great kind of culture war moment in Oxford over freedom of speech and so on, and wokery and all the rest of it. And I try and find practical ways to help them understand how to channel all of that sense of agency and activism that the smartphone gives them, which is wonderful. They have much more sense of agency and activism than certainly I ever had as a student. But I'm trying to get them to see that it's not just about putting a hashtag on the front of something or tweeting something or signing a petition or a letter to me. You've got to kind of get out there and do something. And Ukraine was one example where I was in trouble with the students for not flying the Ukrainian flag. And they said that was I pro-Russian and so on. And I said, look, I've just been on Radio 4 talking about how we must defeat Putin. It's not that I'm pro-Russian, it's just I'm not going to fly a flag for the sake of a flag. It's not enough. I'll do it if we collectively do something for Ukraine. And so I got a lorry and we filled it. Well, actually, in a teachable moment, 4 students turned up to fill the lorry. And I said, well, we're not flying any flags until you can actually do something for Ukraine. And the next weekend, everyone turned up, and then we lit the Hertford Bridge blue and yellow. And they learned that you have to have practical action alongside the virtue signalling, alongside the visible signs of solidarity. But I do think also you're right on us needing to have a bit of humility about our own democratic system. I've just finished this Radio 4 documentary on the battle for liberal democracy. I should have really recorded it in this Augusta building. And we looked at security, justice, and opportunity. Where are the autocrats beating us? And trying to be honest, rather than just saying, we've got the best system. Post-1989, at the end of history, everyone is going to head in our direction and be more like us. We looked very practically at people's lives. Security, justice, opportunity. Where were their lives better or worse? And one very clear conclusion was that many of the autocracies, including some of those slightly more benign-looking autocracies, think of the Gulf, for example, have found ways of digitalizing government delivery that are much more effective and responsive than our own. And that young people can see that when they want to order a pizza online and it turns up 5 minutes later, and yet they can't influence their politics through their phones, that they're waiting 5 years for an election to elect a member of parliament who then is very, very distant. I know we have some fantastic ones like Tobias around. They feel very, very disengaged. So I do think reform of our own democratic systems to be more adaptable and responsive to digital technology is a massive part of the answer.
You called it Ambassador? Yes.
Thank you very much, Tom. Jukka Siukosari, Ambassador of Finland. At the end of the introduction, you came up with the term convening power, which of course figured quite strongly in the integrated review and made it through the refresh as well. Now, with your history in public service in the UK and now with your liberty as an academician, how would you rate or rank the UK as a convening power in the world today?
Ooh.
Sorry.
Thanks for that one. I teach a class at the university called How Not to Answer a Question. So, Ambassador, how would you rate Britain's convening power?
It's classified. I've sent it to Helsinki.
Okay. So, well, I think let's be honest, I think it's diminished from where it was. And I think unless we accept that, then we won't work out how to rebuild. I think we still have fantastic convening power around soft power, the creative industries, sport, music, the coronation. There's clearly an enormous part of the brand that is still pretty much intact. I think where the real damage has been done in recent years, and this isn't a comment on Brexit, but it's a comment on post-Brexit politics, has been in this sense that the Brits are competent. I think when you work in the Middle East, you get used to the idea that the assumption is that the Brits are behind absolutely everything that's going on. And you spend your whole time saying, look, there isn't a conspiracy. We're not really Derek and I having to say to everyone, we haven't really stitched up the last 80 years of politics in the Middle East. But it's that sense of us being very competent at diplomacy, at banking, at politics, that I think has really taken up. I think we've lost the treble A rating for competence, and it will take a long time to win that back. Interestingly, I find, I was talking to some Iranian friends the other day, and they said, the problem with you guys, with having seen you guys as quite rubbish at this stuff, is that we can no longer blame you for the fact that we're quite rubbish at it. We can no longer say the reason we're in a mess is because the Brits are so cunning, because when you look at the Brits now, they're not that good at this. And so they're having their own existential crisis as a result of that as well. So I think you have to rebuild slowly, and you have to rebuild with quiet, humble competence, and probably not jump to saying we're world-beating at everything until we've actually proven that we are world-beating. I was asked by is this safe to say, I think? I was asked by a recent Prime Minister how we could rebuild trust in the world. I'm just going to let you guess which one. And once I picked myself up from the floor, I said, well, the first thing we can do is stop doing things that build distrust in us. So if you've got the best public broadcaster in the world that's trusted globally, don't vandalize the BBC. If you've got a fantastic aid organisation, which it genuinely is world-beating, don't smash it up and force everyone to leave. If you've got creative industries that really are world-beating, then give them some oxygen. Anyway, that went down like a lead balloon, as you can imagine. I wasn't asked back, but then he was gone a few weeks later.
Gentleman at the back. Yes, you. It's coming. Yeah.
I'm Peter York from the Media Society. I'm increasingly convinced that one of the answers to the problem of a perfect future is Western populations which are media literate, which is a fancy word for understanding how you might be conned in 1,000 ways. Yeah. And I become increasingly convinced that all sorts of people, including people who think they're pretty much across these issues, not just the unwashed, are conned on a constant basis, and it may be directly from a Russian troll farm, or it may be Ron from Barking repeating what he's got via Facebook and a Russian troll farm. But how do we make media literate liberal democracies?
Well, I suppose the lazy answer I'm going to try again is education, and so it does start with teaching people that critical thinking, teaching them in the way that we learn how to interact with a source and interrogate a source and argue over it in a tutorial with a very smart tutor and pick it apart and put it back together again. We need to now do that with our young people, in fact with ourselves as well, because it's not a young person's problem, it's a problem for our generation as well. I think many of the young people I work and teach actually have a healthier relationship with some of what they're reading than I do. So I think a massive part of it is about education. And then another massive part of it, in a way it comes back to the ambassador's question, is about thinking much more robustly about how we retain trust and how we build trust in our institutions, as you said, Michael. Recognizing trust as this very powerful currency and one that we can no longer take for granted. We're in a world where the smartphone means that it's not just institutions that are distrusted, it's not just governments, it's not just diplomats since Iraq, it's not just journalists since the journalist scandals, it's not just bankers since the financial crisis, but there's, when you look at the Pew research, rising distrust in anything that looks like institutions or authority. Michael Gope, I don't think he actually said that we've all had enough of experts in so many words, but he may as well have done now, because that's what we all believe he said. That sense of, the fragility of expertise and the fragility of reason. And you see it not just in those institutions, but in teachers. I dropped my 11-year-old off at school this morning, and within 5 minutes, there are 20 WhatsApp messages on the parental WhatsApp group saying they haven't done enough maths this week, they're not doing enough reading, they're doing too much of this. And I don't think previous generations of parents would ever have had that sort of debate about whether the teacher was to be trusted. Anyone who's been to the doctor, my black eye, knows that within 5 minutes you check the diagnosis with Dr. Google. So we're losing trust in anything that looks like expertise and authority or a hierarchy, and I think that's chilling. But any of us who are working in or with institutions have to think about how do we really retain that kite mark for trustworthiness. And that's whether you're a country, whether you're the UK or the UN or a university or a profession like the media.
Another gentleman at the back.
Arthur Berwick from the CGS Fellowship Group.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Tom. Your optimism is brilliant, and it's really refreshing to see, especially when you are still able to quote such things like the systems we built with blood and sacrifice are simply not up to the task, which I'd agree with in certain areas. But a lot of your writing depends on AI and whether or not that's a threat or an opportunity. Would it be dangerous to propose that perhaps it's neither, and it's just an accelerated form of communication, and that actually several thousand years ago, Cicero and perhaps even Genghis Khan said, hey, we live in the fastest communicating world we've ever lived in, and they'll say that tomorrow and every new day of history. So is AI a revolution in your eyes or an evolution of what we've got already?
I think it's an evolution, but it's a faster evolution than we've experienced with the previous communications revolutions. And so, for example, I think the printing press is the closest thing you can compare the internet to. And we're now in this sort of period, a bit like after the printing press, when it's just lots of noise and the rules can't quite keep up. The rules will catch up with the internet. They are catching up. My worry with AI is how do the rules move fast enough to keep up? Overall, Anthony Selden's written a book on will it infantilize us or set us free, looking particularly at education. And that's where I spend most of my time looking at the impact of AI. And I should say that at the college, we've got 2 or 3 of the people who may well be inventing the systems that will replace humanity. I should probably not encourage them any further. But when you look at the work they're doing, the instinctive reaction of a lot of educators is to see this as a massive threat. And just think, well, how do we stop people using it? But I actually go along with the Sam Altman view, and others have said it, that you won't be replaced by AI, you'll be replaced by someone using AI effectively. And that's what we've got to allow our young people and our educators to do in the way that we don't think twice now about young people using a calculator when they're doing their maths. I see academics already using AI in extraordinary ways to do amazing things in their fields. So I'm not so worried about its impact on academia and research. I'm more worried about its impact on the rules that protect our liberty and security and how we ensure those evolve as quickly.
One very quick follow-up.
No.
Who won? It was a diplomatic draw.
Gentleman in the middle, here, on this side.
Thank you. Last week we saw President...
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Sorry?
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. Ghaith Amanazib, formerly ambassador of the Arab League in London. Last week we saw President Assad being received at the Arab League summit in Jeddah. Would you see that as a positive example of this kind of peace and reconciliation you spoke about earlier, or as a deplorable glossing over and covering up of a record of unspeakable atrocities?
When I was in number 10, I wrote one of the dumbest memos that number 10 ever issued. I can't remember the context, but I wrote, we shouldn't be talking to people with blood on their hands. And then I went to Lebanon and realized that actually if I didn't talk to people with blood on their hands, then actually I'd have nothing much to do. And I'm very marked by having worked for 4 years on Northern Ireland. A story I tell often about being at an event on peace and reconciliation, and someone stood up and said, was talking about the need to move on from the conflicts of the past. And I said, why are you here? And she said, my father was killed in the Brighton bombing. And I turned to the man next to her and said, and why are you here, sir? I thought it was her brother or her friend. And he said, I was the bomber. And, that for me was, the essence of diplomacy and actually the essence of education as well. And so all that marks me, and yet I cannot bring myself to say anything positive about Assad going to the Arab League summit. I'm absolutely horrified by it. And I wish that I could find a way to think about coexistence and reconciliation and moving on from that history and that recent past, but it's all too recent for me and too close, having lived in Lebanon. I'm incredibly disappointed that it's happening.
We've got time just for one last question, I'm afraid. Keep it short. I'm going to ask Debbie if... I'll ask Debbie if she asks a short question.
Very short question is, how do we learn to listen more? We all seem to be talking at each other these days, whether it's on social media. How do we learn to listen more and not talk at each other? How do we instill that in our younger generations?
What a brilliant question. Can I just listen to the question? I'm listening to the silence now for a while while I try and think of an answer. So one thing I try to do with the students is to help them understand you don't have to have and then express an opinion on absolutely everything. There's this sense of, they call it FOMO, fear of missing out. And I think there's a lot to be said for letting some of the arguments just move on by. I think one great innovation of last two or 3 years, it's taken longer, but a really great trend of the last 2 or 3 years has been the massive growth of interest in podcasts. And that's a form of listening to others, and rather than feeling that you have to be in every argument, of actually absorbing debate, absorbing discussion. I don't know, does anyone have a better answer on how can we learn to listen? I need to go away and think about this for months.
Can I be controversial and just say that the political debate across the globe, the way politicians speak to one another, what sort of example does that set, dare I say it? That if you're, at the heights, the people who govern us do set an example to young people, and we see that on social media when they comment.
Absolutely. I think one real challenge that I see for our politicians, and it was the case when I was in number 10, is it's getting harder and harder to be really strategic. That they feel more and more buffeted. When I was in number 10, we were responding to the Sky News ticker. We just kept trying to get 140 words on the Sky News ticker. I thought there'd be a room full of really smart people spinning globes and so on. And there were just a bunch of us, teenagers with phones trying to get stuff on the news. And that's before the social media revolution. And I think that is a massive challenge particularly for liberal democracies, with the turnover of leaders, the turnover of political power. How do we create more time for our political leaders to listen and to think and to strategize? But we're with one, so I should ask you the question, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I'm afraid we've run out of time. As you know, I always do. I always insist on closing this at exactly 2 o'clock, so we'll have to leave it. But I do believe that the only thing that matters in this world is talking to each other. So many problems are caused by refusing to talk to each other. However bad people are, talking doesn't make it worse. And with that, I must say I've had a fascinating afternoon, and that is due totally to you, Tom. I'm sure you have too. Lots of other questions coming, but I couldn't have time to put them all. But I'd ask you to thank Tom in the usual way.